Those of you that have been following my channel since before I took a break from YouTube might remember a collab I did with Utterface and Minimal Headroom, in which I warned about the dangers of punching those whom we deem deserve it and asked how long do you think the left can keep pushing until they get pushed back? Well, at Charlottesville we got our answer. After the mainstream media seemingly turned a blind eye to the violent left-wing thugs that showed up to protest against Milo Yiannopoulos at Berkeley because in their mind, a gay ethnic Jew who is now married to a black person is somehow a Nazi and a white supremacist. After ignoring the bullying and harassment that Trump supporters have had to deal with, and after all the anti-white rhetoric that has been acted on college campuses under the skies of safe spaces and non-white days and other such bullshit, it only took an equally cowardly act which resulted in 19 injured and 1 dead for the mainstream media and the regressive left to all of a sudden care about violent protesters, violence in politics, and racism. With the tragedy that happened, you would have thought that this would have been a good opportunity for the mainstream media to look at themselves and ask, do we have a moral responsibility to call out any act of violence, no matter where it's coming from? But no, instead we get some of the same hysterical bullshit that we've gotten to know quite well over the last few months. With the media outcry and the news sources such as The Guardian just outright saying that Trump is a neo-Nazi sympathizer in an article that reads more of a blog than an actual news story, you would have thought that Trump refused to call out the alt-right altogether or stood behind a Nazi flag doing the Nazi salute shouting "Hail fucking Hitler." So what has Trump, the evil racist dictator, done this time? Oh, Trump had the audacity to blame both sides for the violence. There aren't any bad tactics, just bad targets, right? So, of course, it's wrong for fucking Trump to call out the left-wing violence because they're hitting the right people. Except for those times where they don't hit the right people, they dox the wrong person and potentially ruining his life. The BBC, ever the shining beacon of aggressive left-wing politics, pretending to be anything but the biased news source that it is, also chimed in the usual manner, presenting their own opinions via selecting statements from others in an attempt to fake some form of neutrality. So what were they critiquing? Firstly, that he waited for all the facts before making a detailed statement. Secondly, that he didn't condemn the far right specifically at first. And thirdly, when he did, suggesting that it was only because he was advised to do so to defuse the situation. So what I'm getting from this then is that if Trump doesn't criticise the alt-right specifically, he's a neo-Nazi sympathiser. Yet if he does criticise and condemn the alt-right and white supremacists specifically, he's just a secret neo-Nazi sympathiser. Perhaps the most telling line is this. In any regards, Mr. Trump has shown little reluctance in jumping to conclusions about violent incidents when it appears that Islamic extremism is at play. To those whom the difference between the Charlottesville incident and Islamic terrorism isn't obvious, I'll try and spell it out now. A. Islamic terrorism usually involves someone blowing themselves up, shooting up civilians and or stabbing them, and thus lacks the complexity of a left-wing, right-wing battle that has been brewing for months. It takes two sides to brawl, only one side to shoot down a civilian. Secondly, when someone shouts Ali Akbar before going on a senseless rampage, his motives are obviously apparent. This isn't the case when the car just runs into a crowd and drives off. Any motive, no matter how clear it may seem, is speculative and not self-proclaimed. Now, had the driver shouted, "Die nigger, die," then the BBC might have had a point, but as this was not the case, this point the BBC are trying to make is kind of void and lacks substance. The BBC then proceed to do guilt by association by reporting on tweets that a former KKK leader tweeted out, as if that adds anything of substance to the news article. But being connected to a KKK member via some loose association, it wasn't a problem when it comes to Hillary. who was mentored by an ex-KKK leader, but that's neither here nor there. Of course, the motives behind this media backlash is revealed to us at the end of the article. To them, this is literally just another stick to poke Trump with in their ongoing war between Trump and the media, regardless of common sense. Of course, the media has had its fair share of backlash from this, as political commentators online have pointed out the glaring hypocrisy and the fact that silent and fragile defences have been the norm when it comes to left-wing violence. And how have they responded to this? Seemingly by doubling down. The Independent, which is about as neutral as Twitter, released an article criticising Theresa May for refusing to criticise Donald Trump for partially blaming anti-fascists, a group which has become known for its violent tendencies. If I was to make a presumption, however, I would say that this criticism of Theresa May isn't the main purpose of this article. That's just a way to draw people in so they click on the link. I would say that the main reason for this article was to paint a black and white picture of the far right versus Antifa, a situation in which Antifa are the good guys and the far right are the bad guys. In it quotes the British Community Secretary who tweeted, "Neo-Nazis bad, anti-Nazis good. I learned that as a child," and that's pretty obvious. This idea seems to be quite prevalent on the far left at the moment, either with us or you're against us, which, this incident is only likely to fuel further. Amazingly, you can be against fascism and Nazis and not be what they call an Antifa, which is basically just a fucking communist. It's called liberal. I mean, how arrogant is the name anti-fascist? As if that's just not the normal state for most people, to be against fascism. And how ironic it is that the anti-fascists are probably displaying more traits of actual fascists than the Nazis are at this point. I mean, they've got book burning down, they've got beating up political opponents down, they've got censoring free speech down, tearing down political monuments that they disagree with, and they practically wear a fucking uniform. A desire to control the outcome of everything, no respect for personal property, and to top it all off, a self-entitlement complex. The response from far-left supporters has also been rather comical, with memes attempting to say that left-wing violence and right-wing violence isn't the same thing, and the right are actually the baddies, by pointing out that only 19 have died in the left-wing terrorist attacks since 1995, and over 100 in right-wing terrorist attacks, in America that is. As is typical from far-left arguments, this has many flaws. First of all, if we were to accept this logic and go, yep, that proves it, that the right-wingers are the bad guys and the left-wings are the good guys, well, your defense of Islam is completely fucked. Since 1995, they make up 92% of all terrorist-related deaths in America. And even if you take out 9/11, the number is still a majority, with 52% of deaths due to Islamic terrorists. Also, the majority of the right-wing terrorist attack deaths also come from the 1995 Oklahoma bombings, which upon from some further research seems to be motivated by anti-government sentiments, resentment towards agencies such as the FBI. Now, considering that the left-wing line at the moment is that this right-wing protest was with Trump and therefore pro-government, and it's actually the far left who are now the anti-government, it would seem oversimplistic then to divide all the political violence into two groups, left-wing and right-wing, as clearly the right-wing group that is anti-government is not going to be the same right-wing group that is pro-government. And if you take the right-wing anti-government terrorist attacks out of the number of pro-government terrorist attacks, that's now down to 60 deaths, not 160. Now, the number of deaths in left-wing terrorist attack is still only 19. However, there is a problem with a similar graph which shows injuries caused by terrorists. In that, to my knowledge at the very least, despite the fact that Antifa fit every definition of a terrorist organisation, it seems they aren't added to the statistics. So this case, such as the man who was beaten into a coma for 7 days, or those attacked and injured at other events, would not be added to the statistics. Basically, making the graph almost useless, at least when it comes to injuries. And there's one last thing I would like to point out. If you're doing a numbers game on the amount of deaths caused by the far left and the far right, are you sure that's a road you want to go down? Because communism and socialism has killed a hell of a lot more than fucking Nazis. Now I've got this revolutionary idea. Instead of going for communism or the Nazis because one is more evil than the other, so therefore we must choose the opposite, how about we just choose neither and go with something we know works? Maybe liberalism. Just food for thought.